There we go. Okay, so I'll just say it again briefly for the recording, but I'm Terry Nichols. Oh, did I miss anybody? I think I got everyone. Did everyone introduce themselves? Okay. I'm Terry Nichols. I'm with the Montana Watershed Coordination Council, and this funding opportunity, the Big Sky Nonpoint Source Project Support Grants, are, as you've hopefully all seen in the request for proposals that went out, it's aimed at reducing and preventing non-point source pollution, improving water quality in waterways. And there are definitely some eligibility things around that we'll talk more about. But thanks to everybody for being here. So just going through, we've already done introductions. I want to ask this question in just a minute in case, just to make sure I touch on everything, but I'll basically go through the grant. I'll go through it. And if you've read the request for proposals, and hopefully you have, this will mostly be a review and a chance to ask questions and get more clarification on things. And then we'll have a little bit of time for you to share your ideas. It sounds like a few of you at least have some ideas, project ideas already percolating. And then I will talk at the end about match funding. Ellie and Angelo have already heard this because they already have our cost share funding, which is a separate pot of funding that just funds their positions. And so if you guys want to duck out at that point because you've already heard it, or if you want to hear it again, it's basically the same, but just about what match funding is, because that's always a tricky thing. And so I just want to ask that question first. Is there anything in particular that you guys want to know, that you want to make sure that I get to during this time together?
I think it's just requirements and like reporting requirements of this grant.
Okay. I will. I don't have that in because to me, I'm like, well, and we'll get there, but I will definitely add that at the end. There's a little bit on that in the RFP, but not as much as I would like there to be. So I'll include that. Thanks. Anything else? Okay. And then also, just so you know, in that request for proposals, there is like an FAQ document in there too, and has additional information as well. So just so you're clear, and especially when we get into the match funding, although MWCC is a nonprofit, all of this funding from the Watershed Fund, all of our grants come from various different sources. And this funding in particular is actually federal funding. It's from the Federal Clean Water Act, which comes through the EPA, which then goes to state agencies, which in this case is Montana DEQ. And then Montana DEQ has their own, they have a round open right now of 319 funding for larger projects. You certainly could apply to that, but you're not going to get the funding before your term is over. And so this is an opportunity. They give us a small chunk of this funding to fund much smaller projects that members are able to get done, within your shorter time frame. And so that'll just be something to keep in mind when we talk about, if you receive this funding, you need to provide match funding, like funding from other sources as well. And that has to be non-federal, because the federal government wants to see that it's not just them funding this project, that you have other support. And also, this is the same source as our Big Sky Watershed Corps cost share funding, which pays host sites part of the cost share fee that they need to pay to host you guys. So if you have that funding already and you then receive this funding, we'll just have to talk about how to keep those separate, because you'll be tracking some similar things, but you just need to not be double reporting on them. But that's down the line, just something to know. So the purpose of the grant, this is all in the request for proposals, but this is what we're talking about with the DEQ accepted watershed restoration plans. There's a link in here, but I already dropped it in the chat. It needs to be aligned with those local plans. And the additional goals of this funding are to support projects that align with local watershed priorities, measurably improve natural resources. So it's not uncommon that the types of small projects you might work on aren't going to have a huge impact on non-point source pollution, but they're going to have other benefits. And then increasing local capacity to do more of this work after you're gone, and then also providing professional development experience to you all. There's not a whole lot of grants out there that are fairly accessible and that you're going to be able to accomplish in your terms. And so this kind of gives you an opportunity to do that. This is Luke, I think you touched on this, the 2020, the impaired waters list. Any water body you work on also has to be on that list. There are cases where if you have a project that's on a tributary of one of these impaired water bodies, you can sometimes make a case that like this tributary is contributing to that impairment, but that's something we would need to talk about. So if that's the case, if you are planning to work on any water body that is not on this list, definitely give me a call, because it's only going to be eligible, and I'll have to talk to DEQ about it if that we can show that tributary is impacting the body that's listed in this list. It's also called, you might also hear people call this the 303D list, because that's where it is in this long EPA DEQ document. And only Big Sky Watershed Corps members can apply for this, which is nice because you're not competing with the larger watershed world, but we totally understand that you will be, and you need to be, working with your host site supervisor on this, or somebody in your host site staff. We don't expect that you can put together a project all by yourself, because you just don't know all the people yet. And hopefully they have projects and ideas in mind and can work with you on that. But you will be the person applying for this funding, the person working with me to get the funding agreement in place, and the person who does the grant reporting, and the person who leads and makes sure the project happens. Again, in the RFP, you can ask for up to $8,000. You may not need $8,000. Ask for what you need, not like what you think will fund. And then there is that 60 federal, non-federal match requirement. There's a little formula around that. And we'll talk about that more toward the end. Oops, forgot to silence my phone. Okay, and then another sort of eligibility thing, in addition to the things I've already outlined, you have to be serving with a watershed conservation organization that's increasing the capacity of local communities, hosting a Big Sky member, which check, and then implementing a DEQ approved watershed restoration plan. And we line this out, especially that first one, because we don't give funding to state or federal agencies. We don't give funding to, often we don't give funding to larger nonprofits. It depends. It's a little case by case, depending if you're supporting that local capacity. But we generally, but like Montana Audubon, MCC, like you are supporting local capacity. So we just have to work through that. But in general, we want to support those local groups who are doing the work on the ground. Any questions so far? There are also some, again, in the RFP, there are some more technical things, like you have to be registered with the Montana Secretary of State, and you have to have liability insurance. And those are all things to check in with your host site supervisors about. I'm pretty sure all of your organizations have those things. Eligible projects, there's a whole list in the request for proposals. Low-tech restoration is definitely on that list. A lot of members, riparian vegetation, Ellie, a lot of the stuff that the Water Partnership is doing, riparian vegetation, a lot of livestock fencing or off-stream watering for livestock, and even maintenance of past restoration projects sometimes all can count. That's not a definitive list. You may have some really creative, exciting idea that doesn't quite fit into those. As long as it fits the other criteria, that project is eligible. With any grants, there's always a difference between what's eligible and what's competitive, right? So as you saw on a previous slide, you can receive up to $8,000 for a grant, but we only have $32,000 available. So if we end up funding $8,000 projects, that's only 4 projects. And there are, I think, like 9 people signed up for this webinar who might be interested in this. So, sometimes we have people ask for less and we're able to fund 6 or maybe even 7 projects, but it is a competitive process. And so your project may be 100% eligible. It might fit the criteria, but it might not have as many benefits. There might be, other things with it where it's not as clearly explained. We don't really know what you're talking about. And that you might not get funding even if your project is eligible, because it is a competitive process. And then this is where I just wanted to ask you, a couple of you touched on this already, but did anybody else have like a specific project idea that they wanted to throw out and just see if it might be eligible?
Yeah, I'll go. I had something, yeah, with repairing revegetation and like maintaining fencing on this landowner's ranch.
Mhm.
Um, there's been previous projects there, but they just need some uh upkeep and also um like going onto new parts of the stream.
Mhm.
But I'm noticing that it's like a tributary to the East Fork.
Mhm.
I'm just looking now on the impaired streams,
Mhm.
and it's not directly highlighted. So now I'm a little like, I don't know if this is the time to ask, but like how to
Mhm.
phrase it if it's.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that separately, either at the end of this webinar, or if you drop off early, you can give me a call. Um, because I also wonder, I know the Water Partnership has had Big Sky members in the past that have worked on projects, and I almost wonder do you know what's the name of the tributary?
Yeah, it's Cameron Creek.
Okay, I think DEQ. Anyway, that might be. Anyway, we'll talk more about that. But yeah, it's possible. But yeah, if it's not listed, we just have to talk. But yeah, vegetation projects in general, and especially, that's always great if you have a landowner who's like, I've done a little bit of work and I've seen that this has had benefits and I want to do some more. I think that we're always interested in stuff like that because it shows that, yeah, people are interested in continuing this and having bigger impacts, right? Instead of just having really small projects. So that's great. Anybody else have a specific project they want to share or ask about? And that's fine. We can also talk about things later. Oh, I already advanced. So restrictions. Again, this is all in the request for proposals, but education. Oh, I should have worded this a little bit better. Education and outreach are allowed, but I'm just going to pee, so don't say the wrong thing. Because I didn't write that in my notes. Oh, okay, yes. Programs for which the main activities are education and outreach, right? So this is supposed to be project-based. This is not for education outreach, but if you're doing, say, a project tour or creating a video or doing a blog post, that stuff can be funded. Your time can't be funded on this grant, which is a thing I'll get into because you don't have an hourly rate and and we already have a grant for that. But like your staff who might help you with things, if you need materials for these sorts of things, you can request funding for those sorts of things if it's education and outreach around your project, about your project, but it can't be more than 20% of the total funding request. And then the other restrictions, equipment, you might need, like we've had members, maybe your host site doesn't have waiters and you need waiters. You can use those sorts of things for this grant as long as it's not more than 20% of your budget. Food also isn't covered. It's a long story, federal grants. We just don't do it. Get somebody to donate food for your volunteer events because it's a pain in the butt with these federal funds, so we don't cover it. And then we also can't cover administrative costs on this grant for various reasons. And then, as I just said, your time can't be covered by it. But we can cover time for staff to work with you on the project if they're, can be counted as match or can be counted under this grant. Did anybody have any questions about, I guess just, if you have questions, just shout them out, drop them in the chat as we go along, it's fine. The timeline, I just wanted to highlight that if you want to submit a draft proposal, that again, that's in the RFP, and if you're going to do that, please, please, please also submit your draft budget and that task deliverables timeline spreadsheet, in addition to the narrative, because that's really kind of like the bones of what you're doing, and is often the thing I have the most questions about, especially your budget. So, but if you want to submit a draft, just do it by March 20th and I'll get it back to you. I think the 20th is a Wednesday and the 22nd is a Friday. So I'll get it back to you so you can finish up the next week. You don't have to do that. There's no penalty. I don't, and to clarify, I am not a reviewer for the Watershed Fund. I manage the process. I coordinate the reviewers. I host the review meetings, but other people, volunteers, will be reviewing your proposals. So you have to take my feedback. My feedback is based on what I've seen over the last 5 or 6 of these grant cycles, what I know, what's eligible, and also just general understanding of what you're trying to communicate. So if you submit a draft proposal and I give you feedback, it does not mean you're going to get funding. It does not guarantee you funding. And I'm also not telling the reviewers so they don't know, oh, this person didn't submit a draft. So it's not going to have any impact on like what the reviewers think of you or your scoring or anything. But it can just help you have a better proposal in general that's more likely to get funded. So if you want to take advantage of that, feel free to email that to me. And there's more information about that in the RFP. And then again, the final deadlines, and you would know if you have funding that week of April 15th. If you receive funding, right, we get into all the other things, which is a lot, because again, these are federal funds and we got to make sure that the projects are being done right. And this is why it says in the request for proposals, and I'll share in here, that often funding agreements don't get signed until mid-May. And they put little fingers crossed, because depending, so I've had some members not get them signed until June sometime. It just depends, but you need to get a signed landowner agreement. And basically those, and I can share those. I generally just share them if you get funding. I'm happy to share them at a time if you want to see what's in there, but it basically asks the landowner, that you can go on the property, and technically MWCC and DEQ can go on the property, but we would never do that without checking in with you to just check up on it. It asks them to just maintain it generally for 10 years. If there's a crazy flood or something happens, they're not liable, but it's just these general, making sure that they really want to make sure this project is maintained and kept up, for the longer term. And then you'll also have, we have to go through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to see if there's going to be any impacts on endangered species. Usually there's hardly anything, and they just say, yep, don't throw trash around and watch out for grizzly bears and report any carcasses. But we still have to go through that process, and you have to agree to those recommendations. So both of those things take a little time, and we can't sign the funding agreements until mid-May, which means I tell everybody, don't count on starting project work until June, late June, just in case. But the reality is most of these projects happen in the fall anyway, so it's usually not a problem, especially things like planting willows, which have to go dormant, and things like that. Planting plants in general is better to do in the fall when you're about to get some rain. But just keep that in mind when you're doing your timeline, when you're thinking about everything. Don't count on starting anything until June. And then also, as soon as you get your MOU signed, you'll want to start tracking everything you buy, all the hours that your coworkers might spend helping you on this project, volunteer hours. You'll just want to be tracking everything. And I said this in the cost share webinar, but track everything right from the start. But we get into that if you get funding. And then that's just the deadline on the interim reports. And I will just, because Audrey asked about this, I am not, we have 3 grant cycles going, and I'm not always great at getting those done, but I'm happy to send last year's reporting form out to you guys. I'll just do that, just so you can see it. We always try to streamline it, make it a little easier every year. I don't think we're going to be adding anything this year. Let me just make a note. But basically we try to make the interim report the shortest, like really, we just want an update of what you're doing. As you see, it's going to be due in August. If you're not starting work till late June, you're probably not going to have a lot to report. But because this is probably your first grant, probably the first project that you're managing, it's just a way to check in. It's just a way to say how things are going. And often you haven't done a whole lot at all. You've just been talking to the landowner, or, just planning things. But it's a good way to get you on that. And then the final grant and the interim report has, and be thinking about all these things for your final report. And then the final report is a bit longer. So I'll send you both of those. Know that they won't be exactly the same this year, but they'll be similar. Tips on your proposals. This is roughly it's up to you. We all work differently, but I generally recommend working on it in this order if you can. First you want to have that conversation with your host site supervisor or host site staff. first of all, what is your project? What, and hopefully they've already talked to the landowner who, and these can happen. Generally they happen on private land, but they can happen on federal or state lands. That's fine. And so then that agency, that would be the landowner, that would be your partner. But you need to have talked to them. You need to have talked, just talk through what are your goals? Why are you doing this project? And not just because it's on the WRP, but or the impaired list, but like, what is this project going to do that's going to address the, where there's sedimentation or too much nitrogen, phosphorus, heavy metals. What is your project going to do that's going to improve water quality and that's going to improve maybe habitat or stream function, or whatever the outcomes of that are going to be. So think about what your goals are going to be and who aside from the landowner might be involved in that project. Maybe Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, maybe your local conservation district. Just thinking about, talking to them from the start. And then you want to ask for letters of support. So letters of support, we've gone back and forth on this. They are not required. However, if you don't have any letters of support, it probably will negatively impact. So every year we're like, we should just make them required because it's not like you can't get funding without letters of support, but we at least want to see a letter from the landowner saying, yes, I want this project to happen. And here's why. Here's how it's going to benefit me and the lake or the stream. And if you don't have that, it's just going to be a little, because we're going to be like, are they really on board? Because we've had a couple situations in the past where projects fell through because there were conversations that weren't had with the landowner. So if you can get that letter of support up front, again, you should be talking to them already anyway, then we just all know that they are 100% on board. Letters of support from other partners can be great too. Agencies, other people you may be working with. But that landowner letter especially is really important. Again, not required, but highly encouraged and will improve your review score. Then once you get, because that takes time, right? They might not get it back to you for a week or two. So once all that happens, and you can do these at the same time too, right? Because you just need to start on them. But the task deliverables timeline spreadsheet and the budget proposal spreadsheet, we'll go through those in a minute. But those are kind of like the foundation of your proposal and often the trickiest to go to. And then once you know, like, okay, what are the tasks we have to get done? What are the things we want to accomplish? Deliverables tend to be like how many plants you're going to plant, how many BDAs you're going to put in. And you won't know the exact number. It's always going to be an estimate because things will change once you get on the ground, but just approximately how many volunteers you might think might be working with you. Maybe you want to create an educational sign. That's a deliverable too. Maybe you want to do a project tour or put out some flyers for a volunteer event. Like those things are all deliverable. Deliverables are just sort of like tangible things that come out of your project that are different from, right? Your goals are more like the outcomes or the what you accomplish, but the deliverables are tangible things you'll be able to show us and say, look, we planted 300 trees. Look, here are before and after photos of our work, that sort of thing. And then once you've got your tasks and your timeline and your budget, and then maps and photos, you need to create a map, and all of that stuff is then going to help you write your narrative. And if you're like me, I'm the kind of person who likes to just write everything first. You totally can do that, but just know that these things are what's going to inform your narrative. So for whatever that's worth. Questions?
I do have a quick question related to just like the whole PowerPoint. Will this PowerPoint be available?
Yes, great question. I always mean to mention that so you don't have to take quite such furious notes during the thing, but yes, I will make this available. Thanks.
Thank you.
I pretty much already said this, but this is the grant, this is the groundwork for your narrative. And then for the narrative itself, and when I say the narrative, I mean the part of the grant that's like the questions that you answer. You want to articulate to us, what is your goal? Like I just said, this stream is impaired for sedimentation, right? There's way too much sediment in the water. It's, hurting fish habitat, blah, blah, blah. And this project, by planting these trees and native shrubs, it's going to reduce that sedimentation. It's also going to improve, it's also going to cool the waters and improve fish habitat. It's also going to create pollinator habitat. Whatever that is, you need to be able to articulate in that, the narrative part. And then I always share, it's like, you don't have to be a great writer. We are not, I think I said this on the grant panel at the EO training. We're not looking for like, oh, you're the best writer ever. That's not why we're in this profession, to be great writers. If you are, wonderful. But it's really just connecting those dots and telling the story. Like, here is the problem. Here is how we're going to help, you know, you're probably not going to fix the problem with your small project, but here's how we're going to make the situation better. Here's how we're going to improve this. And here's how we're going to do it. That's really, those are the dots that you need to connect. And then hopefully your budget and your project's tasks, timeline, spreadsheet supports that with those details. These are some definitions. I'm not going to go over these in super detail because, like I said, you'll get the slides. But just things to keep in mind, because all these words I use a lot. They're in the request for proposals. They're going to be in your grant application to some extent. So just be clear on the difference between these things. One thing to note is that other grants will often have tasks, activities, and deliverables. And for various reasons, we don't have, but the activities are just the smaller things you need to get done to accomplish your tasks, right? If your task is revegetate 200 feet of stream bank, one of your activities is going to be buying plants. Another one is going to be planting plants or recruiting volunteers. And we don't necessarily need to know about all of those activities. We just need to know what the task is. But you can and should explain those activities, explain how you're going to accomplish the task in your narrative. In that spreadsheet, you just have to give us the task, when you think you'll get it done, and then what the deliverables are, like what the tangible outputs of that are going to be. And then in your narrative is where you'll flesh out a little bit more how you're going to get this done. Definite budget. hopefully that's a no-brainer, the budget, but a lot of us haven't, you know, maybe you've never worked on a budget before. So the budget and the tasks and deliverable spreadsheet have to be connected. And then match, because I've been talking about that a lot. I'll just read this. It's funding that you'll use to carry out your project in addition to the funds from this grant. Most funders want to know that they're not the only ones supporting your project. And that's why you have that 40% match for this. Like 60% of your project can be paid for with this grant. The other 40% needs to be paid for with something else. And that can be in kind. We'll talk more about that, but can be volunteer time, can be plants, that's tools that somebody donates for your use, any of that stuff. And as I mentioned before, for this grant, only non-federal match is allowed. Oh, wait, I thought we were, hang on. I think I skipped a part. Yes, I was going to look, we were going to look at an actual example of a successful grant proposal from 2 years ago. And this is all attached to the request for proposals, in addition to more like that person, Mackenzie Tenen was her name, with the Missoula Valley Water Quality District, or anyway. And so that's all, even her letters of support on there, they said it was fine, just so you can see an example of like a good letter of support. I'm not going to share all of that, but I am going to share just the tasks and deliverables and the budget, just to show you an example. So yeah, first thing is both of these spreadsheets have an instruction tab. Please read the instruction tab. As I just mentioned, you don't need to include individual activities, just the main tasks. Deliverables, it kind of explains a little bit more about what deliverables are. And so one thing you can do, there's an example. You can delete that. You don't have to leave it in, but it doesn't matter. But just to know, this is the example. This is not Mackenzie's thing. But, oh, did I have the right? Oh, I'm in the wrong. Hang on. I was gonna, this is somewhere else. 1 second. There it is. I gotta drag this over and see. Can you guys see this spreadsheet now? Okay. Thanks. Anyway, this is Mackenzie's thing for Patty Creek. And yeah, it was Patty Creek. This is actually a little creek that runs through Missoula that some people think of as a ditch. And her whole project was, it was a little more complicated than maybe some of your projects will be, because there was a big outreach and education component to it, where she was reaching out to landowners and getting them to say, hey, we want to do this work, which is a little easier in a city because you have a very small parcel. It's easy to reach a bunch of people with a flyer. If you're working in more rural areas, I don't think this model would work, but it worked really well for her project. And she actually ended up getting, I can't even remember, like 8 or 10 landowners on board. Like they didn't have enough money to do all the restoration that people wanted to do. And so they ended up getting some more money from DEQ, and it was great. It was a really successful project. But so her first task, so this, for most of you, and we always recommend, like, this is a hard way to go. Mackenzie, this took a lot of time. But most of you have a project already identified or will already have a project identified. But in her case, she knew she was going to work in, there was like a city park. So she knew for sure she was going to do restoration in this city park. And that was good enough for us to be like, you're doing something. But they also wanted to reach adjacent landowners and make it bigger. So her first task was actually landowner outreach. You'll see she was hoping to get that done in April and May. I remember that being a thing where I was like, it's not going to happen. So this was a conversation, but ideally you wouldn't have anything before June in here. And these are, again, tangible deliverables. Deliver at least 30 pamphlets, lead at least one public meeting, educate X number. So these sort of numbers things are the kind of deliverables you might have. And yours might be something more like volunteer outreach, right? How many volunteers are you going to, for this project specifically? It can't be general volunteer outreach or anything, but volunteer outreach for this project. And then this task 2, draft and finalize the landowner agreements. Again, that's not going to be a task for you because generally you're going to get the landowner agreement signed after you receive funding. And then assess baseline ecological conditions. Again, not always or even usually part of this, but you can see she has these, how many feet she wants to assess, macroinvertebrate samples. And also just so you know, this got changed because DEQ didn't think this was super effective. They actually have to evaluate some other things. That happens sometimes because they're like, actually, this is not going to tell you what you want to know. And then this is probably the one that would be most applicable. This is sort of the project itself. And for most of you, this is going to be the meat of it. But again, you can see August to October, because that's the time frame she actually had to get that done. Number of volunteers recruited, feet of stream bank, number of plants, and then browse protection. Again, you might have something that's, like I mentioned, volunteer recruitment, partner meetings, like there can be other tasks. But yeah, this is just an example of something that was very, again, more in depth than most of the proposals that we get, but very clear. And that's the thing that I wanted to share. And then we will now open the budgets. Over here. Okay. And again, there's an instructions tab. Read that first. This I tried to make, but this one will autofill on its own as you fill out the different tasks. But you'll see, put her host site name there, project title. So all the reviewers who are looking at this can say, oh, this is, sometimes people will just forget to fill this out and then you don't always know who is this for. And then each of these tasks, this is probably the most important point, second most important point. These need to align with that timeline deliverables spreadsheet, right? So her first task was landowner outreach. In that other spreadsheet, it's also landowner outreach here. So you can look at that and say, okay, here's what she's going to accomplish. And here's basically how she's going to accomplish it. Same thing, task 2, draft and finalize landowner agreements. And task 5 was her actual task. Oh, task 4 disappeared. I don't know what I did. Anyway, there used to be a task 4. So they align, right? So the reviewers, they can see, okay, task 1, here is what this person is going to do. Task 1 in the budget, here is what the proposal, the funding that they're proposing for it. And also to let you guys know, all these things will shift. We do not expect that this will be, that you will have exactly $715 of non-federal matching. Like these are all estimates and you just need to be within a range. And in general, if you say you get a $5,000 grant, up to 10% of that can shift around between your tasks. So maybe you spend a little bit more on one thing and you spend a little bit less on another thing. We totally expect that. And we can talk about that more if you get funding. But the first or second, tied for first place, most important is these details. So explaining, here's what, so we're saying we've got this $1,800 in non-federal in-kind match. This is what it's going to be. Like, here are the things, like this much time for this person, this much time for this person. There are links in the FAQ document to general volunteer rates, but you can also use whatever is just reasonable in your area if you were going to hire somebody from that work, or whatever their billable rates is. But basically, you just want to explain, like, this is what, like, here's where I'm getting this number from, and here's what this is. Oh, staff from my host site are going to help me with these things. Staff from my host site are going to help me with these things. Same thing, like education and outreach materials, printing and postage. And again, we know that these prices will change a little bit, but you should be getting estimates. You know, if you want to print something, find out how much it's going to cost. It does not have to be 100%, but we have to, like, we need to see that, like, oh, you've put some thought into this. These aren't just random numbers that you've thrown out. Any questions about that or anything else I need to go over on those? Okay, and again, it's all on the website and in the slides when I send them out. Where were we now? Okay, so now is the part where I was going to talk about match, which is the part that people can bail on early if they want to, if they already know this or already remember it. And I did want to talk about reporting requirements, but like I said, I'll send those out, Audrey. And there is one other thing to know. I'll just go back to the RFP, the request for proposals. I mean, this is, oh no, sorry, that's the, nope. Yep, we don't have a reporting criteria in here. Never mind. So I will send you those forms and that will tell you what you need to know. Great. But one good rule of thumb with this and any other grant source is, right, the questions that we're asking you in this narrative, which I'm not going to go over because you've got a Word document that shows all those questions that we ask, and even the review criteria that are in there, like, those are going to give you a pretty good indication of what you're going to be reporting on. Like, if just for example, proposed product, like, you're going to have to say, this is the WRP that we did. How did your project address non-point source pollution? There will be things, depending on your project, that will ask you for specific information. And that is mainly DEQ's job, because I'm not a technical person. You'll basically work with Megan to say, you know, you're always going to have to tell us how many feet of stream bank or like what your project area was. But sometimes they're more specific, like some groups might be doing BHI's like bank erosion hazard index analyses. You might want to show how that's changed. There'll be different requirements because we need to be able to quantify what or how much non-point source pollution you've reduced with your project. So that'll be specific to each project, but everything else is general to those reporting forms I'll send out. All right, now for match. Again, there's actually more detailed information on that in the FAQ document that's attached to the RFP. That is like as detailed as I could possibly get on that, but we'll go over this briefly here too, because sometimes it helps to hear it. The slide is crossed out because federal match is not allowed. It is not allowed under this grant. But just to explain to you what it is: grants, donations, any contribution from any federal agency, right? The Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Park Service, any federal agency, they can help you with your project. That is no problem. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service might give you all kinds of help. You just can't count it as match. You can use anything, any resources available to you to get your project done, but you just can't count federal contributions as match. And I also have these crossed out because these are, so DEQ, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, has their own 319 project grants, which some of your organizations, like I know for sure Ruby Valley CD has had one of these. I know for sure that Bitterroot Water Partnership has had one of these. If your organization has an existing separate DEQ 319 project grants, that cannot count as match for this because it comes from the same source. And same thing, Montana Association of Conservation Districts has these other grants. They also all come from this 319 funding. And so does our, this should say Big Sky Watershed Corps cost share support, which is the other grant that some of you have. All of these come from that same DEQ and EPA 319 funding, so you can't use any of that as match. Non-federal match, anything that comes from anyone who is not a federal agency. A list of all these organizations, local businesses, a lot of people don't think about, if they're, again, I always use the example of donating food to volunteer events. That's a common thing for local businesses to do. Individuals, volunteers, right? They're volunteering their time. This can be separate grants. You might have a private foundation grant or an actual state grant, like DNRC has grants that are actually state dollars. But a lot of your match and it'll vary. You might have other grants that are helping to fund your project, but more commonly, your match is mostly going to be in kind. And that's this category this includes donations of time, equipment, materials, mileage. So non-federal cash match, that's the one I just talked about. Actual grants, individual donations, general operating funds. Sometimes groups, including MWCC, you don't have enough money quite to fund a project or your time, and so you use your general operating funds. We hope nobody's doing that because that should go to keep the lights on. But any of these things are cash match as long as they don't come from non-federal sources. And this is that note again to check grants from state agencies because some of them originally come from federal funds. An in-kind match, which I said is mostly what you're going to be using, and you will be shocked at how quickly it adds up. I mean, I've had members be like, I have $10,000, $15,000 in match. And I'm like, great, that's way more than you need, but wonderful. If you keep track of your host site supervisor's time, if they're donating their time, again, this grant can actually pay for their time to help you with this project. But if they have funding from another source, that adds up fast. Volunteer time adds up fast. The landowner who lets you cut willows on their property to plant somewhere else, those willows you would have to pay for somewhere else. If you're low-tech process-based restoration, all of the logs and the willows, all of the vegetation, like that's actually worth something. And generally you're just harvesting that from somewhere nearby. So that all has value. So just create a spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be fancy, but just any time that there's any resource that goes into your project that you would normally have to pay for, whether that's someone's time, materials, equipment, put that in there and it will just add up really quickly. I think this is a good one to know too. Community members attending project tours, because usually when I think of volunteer time, right, you would have to pay those people to help, if they weren't volunteering. But a crazy thing that I have learned in the last few years is that, at least with DEQ, I don't know about all grants, they will also count people's time just learning. So even if you have like a group of high school students who come out to your project and learn about it, and they spend an hour out there, their time is still worth something. It's probably worth minimum wage. That's probably all you want to claim. But it's still worth something. Even if they're not contributing to their project, they're learning about it. You're teaching them something. Your community is benefiting from it. So you can still even count that time. All of these things I think I already mentioned. Mileage is another good one. When you have volunteers, please encourage carpooling. I hope you are. But ask your members, how far did you or your volunteers, how far did you travel? How many miles, and then the state mileage rate right now is 67 cents a mile. And so that adds up really quickly too. And also food, right? If anybody's donating food, whether that's someone who made brownies or whether that's an organization giving you sandwiches. Does that all make sense? Kind of, sort of. Okay. And then this, again, this link is actually here. I think it's also in the request for proposals. I'm not positive, but it's definitely here. In April 20, we do these conservation conversations roughly once a month, except for the summer. And we had one that was on this very topic, and it was great because Christine Brissett, she's with Trout Unlimited, and she is just like a master of tracking match. And there's even a match tracking worksheet that you can use if you want. And that is it. And we have a few minutes for questions, additional information. Okay.
I guess I only had like a brief question, because you covered everything else. If, say, another Big Sky Watershed Corps member and I were gonna do this project together, or like maybe 3 of us or whatever,
Mhm.
is that something we can do, is apply for this under all of our names?
Oh, that is we have never had that happen before. I love that though. I love that idea. I think that would be a great thing. I'm going to think a minute before I just
Yeah,
spew out an answer when I've never thought about this before. The one thing I would say is definitely just have one person apply to it.
okay,
So the platform that we use, Submittable, it is unfortunate, it's a pay, they're a for-profit.
Yeah.
We pay for that. And you have to pay extra to have people like collaborate where like multiple submittable accounts can work on a grant together. So that's
Yeah.
unfortunate, we don't pay for that. But what you can do, if your host site is comfortable with, because we do ask if your host site has an existing submittable account, we ask that you use that, because then they still have a record of that after you leave. And if I call them up and was like, hey, what? They're like, I can't get it in because it's under Audrey's account and we don't have her password, right? So ideally, you're using your host site's account. And if your host site is comfortable sharing, well, one of two things. You can, because we give you the Word document of the narrative, and of course your other things are in spreadsheets, you can just do your whole proposal in that Word doc, like work on it together that way. Create a Google Doc from that Word document, work on it together that way, and then just have one person plug it into Submittable. But I'm going to stick with this. Just one person should actually apply, and one person needs to be responsible for the reporting, for the everything. And they
Okay.
can work, and same thing, the reporting documents, that will be in a Word form also. You can work on it together that way. But I think one person needs to be responsible.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
what I would
thank you.
say in your proposal is like, hey, these other members are working with me on this. Whether they're like, that's great. I think that would be a great selling point. It would be a cool thing to see that, like, maybe you're able to have a bigger impact on it. And another thing, and this would be more complicated, but is also an option, if you had a bigger project that was very, 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 very easy to separate out into 2 chunks, right? Like one person is doing the structures in the stream and one person is doing revegetation, right? This would be hard to do, but if you could do it, because I'm saying, I guess if you needed more money, if you're like, this is a bigger undertaking, you could submit 2 proposals, but you would have to be really clear and let me know and be really clear in the proposals that like, this is part, like these proposals go together.
Right.
And let us know, like, if we only fund one, that can't happen. So the easiest way to do it is going to be one proposal, one person responsible, and have other people contributing to it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but that's a great idea. And if you want to talk more about it, after I've had time to think about it and maybe talk to Megan.
Yeah, and I think we also need some time to figure that out. So yeah, I'll let you know for sure.
Yeah, and it could give you the advantage. Like, I don't know who the groups are that you're working with, but if one of them is more like local than MCC, maybe have that organization, flying organization, so that can help you too.
Right.
Any other questions or thoughts on projects?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the DEQ site that has all the WRPs listed. And the only one for the Ruby I see is the Ruby Watershed Group. And it says it's accepted in 2015. How does that work? Because I think we have like an outdated one, but I don't know we don't have like an updated one.
Totally. And I don't know if you guys are working on an updater yet. That is pretty, like, DEQ likes to have them updated more often than that. But the bottom line is that that proposal is still approved. It's still the way it is. Yeah, you can still apply under that. If you have a watershed restoration plan, you're fine. If it's the only thing to check on, if it's a little outdated, just, yeah, it shouldn't be an issue if it's in there. I mean, check with your host site supervisor that this is still a need, right? They might have said in 2015, this was an issue. Maybe it's not anymore. But no, you can still apply under that. And that does remind me of one other small thing that should be clear, because these are focused on non-point source pollution. But in some of the older watershed restoration plans, there are often things around wildlife habitat and other things that are, of course, important to watershed health, but don't directly impact non-point source pollution. And so you want to make sure, again, it should, if it's on the impaired water list, but you just want to make sure your project does address non-point source pollution, even if there are some things in that older WRP that wouldn't do that.
Okay,
Yeah, but you're still totally eligible.
sounds good.
Okay, we got time for one more question before we get going. All right. Well, and that's it. I will share this recording and the slides, and those two, the interim and final reporting documents from last year, which I'll be updating when I get a moment. But they'll be pretty similar. And everything else you need will be in that request for proposals that you all have the link to. So that should cover everything. I probably won't get those things out until Monday or Tuesday of next week, but I'll get them to you as soon as I can. Yeah. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks for
Terry.
being here, and thanks for
Thank
the work
you.
you're doing, and I'm excited to see some of your proposals. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.